Let's talk about cannabis. As it becomes more and more a part of our daily lives and conversations, there's a really important question we need to ask. What does the science actually say about its risks to our mental health? In this explainer, we're going to dig into the research to find out. So today, we're going to try and cut through all the noise, set aside the politics, and really just focus on what the psychiatric research tells us. We're going to tackle one central question: what are the documented, real-world psychiatric risks of using cannabis? All right, first things first. Before we get into the heavy stuff, let's make sure we're all on the same page. What exactly is cannabis? At its core, cannabis is a substance that comes from the cannabis sativa plant. The reason it has the effects it does is because of its main psychoactive ingredient. You've almost certainly heard of it, THC, which stands for tetrahydrocannabinol. That's the chemical compound that's really responsible for the high. So what happens in the short term? Right after someone uses it? The immediate or acute effects are really well documented, and they tend to fall into a few key categories. Broadly speaking, you can group the immediate impacts into three main buckets: how it affects the way you think and move, how it changes the way you feel and see the world, and of course, how your body physically reacts to it. Now, this is one of the most interesting effects, the one on your mood. Research shows that cannabis doesn't usually create a feeling out of thin air. Instead, it often acts like an amplifier for whatever you're already feeling. So if you're already relaxed, you might feel even more chilled out. But, and this is a big but, if you're feeling anxious, it can ramp that feeling way up. And when you get to higher doses, those cognitive effects really start to stand out. This is where you see some serious impairment of short-term memory, making it tough to follow a conversation or even remember what you just did a minute ago. It can also totally warp your sense of time, making minutes feel like they're stretching on for hours. Okay, so now we're going to shift from those immediate effects to what is probably one of the most serious risks that's been identified in psychiatric research: the connection between cannabis and psychosis. This number right here is, well, it's pretty stark. What the data shows is that cannabis users have a relative risk of 2.0 for developing schizophrenia. To put that in really simple terms, it means using cannabis is associated with a doubling of the risk for developing this very serious mental illness. Now, it is absolutely crucial to understand the difference between two separate conditions here. On one hand, you have what's called cannabis-induced psychosis. This is a temporary state, usually brought on by heavy use, and the symptoms typically go away when the person stops using. On the other hand, you have schizophrenia, which is a chronic, lifelong disorder. The research suggests that for people who are already vulnerable, long-term cannabis use can act as a trigger, potentially precipitating the onset of schizophrenia. So beyond those immediate effects and the serious risk of psychosis, what does the research tell us about the long game? What are the consequences of chronic long-term use? First up, there's the risk of dependence. Now, while the vast majority of people who use cannabis won't experience this, the science is clear that about 9% of users will go on to develop what's known as a clinical dependence. So what does that actually look like? What does it feel like? Well, it's marked by a very clear withdrawal syndrome. The main symptoms include really intense cravings for cannabis, irritability and mood swings, and pretty significant problems with sleep. There's another long-term risk that you hear discussed a lot in the literature. It's called amotivational syndrome. Now, it's not a formal diagnosis like dependence is, but it describes this state of apathy, just a real lack of drive, and having a hard time functioning at work or in social situations, all associated with chronic use. And the list doesn't quite stop there. Research also links cannabis use to other psychiatric issues. For some people, it can actually trigger panic attacks. For others, it can even lead to a more persistent condition called cannabis-induced anxiety disorder, turning something they might be using for relaxation into a major source of stress. Okay, so we have covered a ton of ground here, right? From what happens in the moment to the risks that can build up over years. Let's just pull it all together and boil it down to the key takeaways. So, to recap, in the short term, cannabis messes with your thinking, can amplify your mood, and affects your physical coordination. The big one, of course, is that it's a recognized risk factor for psychosis, potentially doubling the relative risk of developing schizophrenia. And then over the long haul, it carries a real risk of dependence, a tough withdrawal syndrome, and those potential amotivational effects. And that really brings us to our final thought here. So much of the conversation around cannabis is about legality or its potential benefits, but when you know about these documented psychiatric risks, everything from cognitive impairment all the way up to psychosis, how does that change the way we should talk about it and think about it? It's definitely something to consider.